Welcome, everyone. It is just about that time. My name is Celine, and I am a program specialist at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Welcome to everybody who's joining us. I'm very excited for tonight's program. It is, as I like to call it, spooky season. And tonight we have Dr. Erin Baxter joining us. She is the museum's acting curator of anthropology. Her primary area of research is in Southwestern archaeology and museum archives. In her other life, she's an instructor of archaeology at CU Boulder and teaches courses on Southwestern archaeology, method and theory, human prehistory, and her personal favorite, the archaeology of death. I'm so excited for tonight's program. Dr. Baxter, I will turn over the microphone to you to introduce the program.
Right. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out on a Thursday night. This is above and beyond the call. I want to give a special welcome to the adult program participants and to all the volunteers. And I'm new at the museum, and I just can't wait to meet many of you in person and to work with you maybe in the future. So without further ado, then I think I'll just go ahead and get this started, if that's okay, and share the screen. Wow. All right. And please do put your questions in the comments, and I can't wait to answer them sort of at the end. This is just, like I said, it's a basic know before you go, a practical guide to Colorado cemeteries. And much of this comes from research that I've done with students at CU Boulder in Colorado cemeteries. And so some of it's a practical guide, and some of it's actually some brand new research that I'm really kind of excited to share with you. So I'd love to do 4 things tonight. Talk a tiny briefly bit about origin stories and how we got to the cemeteries of today. How these sort of came about in the history of humanity. A little bit on Cemeteries 101, just some very basic fundamental sorts of things. The meat of the presentation, I hope, will be the demography and archaeology, which is really where my passion lies. And then I want to talk about the quirks of Colorado, because, oh my goodness, there are a few things about Colorado, you guys, that are really special compared to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And then I want to save plenty of time for your questions at the end. So please do keep rolling those in as you're able to. So before I start, I want to say that I know that there are lots of aficionados of cemeteries out here, and historians and people who know lots about Colorado history and the like, and I am no sort of specialized experts. Then there are people in other specialties that do cemeteries. Archaeologist is just one tiny fragment of that. But the thing that I think archaeology does that some of these aren't able to do is that we don't focus in on the individual as much. So tonight I won't be talking about, the famous Coloradans in various cemeteries, Simon Sewell, the governors, Baby Doe Tabor, Jack Swigert, those folks. I'm actually going to kind of want to zoom out and look at cemeteries in aggregate across the state and in the grand scope of human history, what we in archaeology call the Long Deray, what it means sort of statistically and from a data point of view. But keeping in mind that each of those individuals under each of those tombstones is, of course, an important story, an important part and component of this. But we just won't get to their individual stories because oftentimes prehistorians, like I'm trained as a prehistorian, don't get to know the stories. We don't even get to know the names of the people that we study. So we use modern cemeteries as analogs to really sort of understand about the ancient past. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to do this grand scheme of things. So let's start off with the good news of the day. And I know that some of you have written in there in the chat, you're never going down. Well, so far you would be bucking a trend in history, and that is that 100% of us will die. And it's something we oftentimes don't like to talk about, but it's a fact of life, is death. And because of that, we should embrace that and sort of talk about it. And this is one thing that I really do enjoy talking with my students. And we've done the math, some people have done the math. This is a broad number, but the estimate is that about 107 billion people have drawn breath and died on this planet in the course of its history. Although I'm going to actually modify that a little bit because there's really new research that changes our minds a little bit about this. So let me just do a quick segue. Oh yes, there's the 107 billion people. I just want to pump you guys up. It's all downhill from here, I promise. There's new research that may push back these numbers a little bit because there's new data that shows that humans aren't the only people who buried their dead. We already know that animals have an awareness of life. We have given up humans being the only people who use tools, the only people who have language, or the only species, I should say, who have tools and have language. And we're definitely probably now not the only species that may have been had an awareness and a practice for death. And this new data coming out of Rising Star Cave in South Africa may indicate that Homo naledi from 350,000 years ago might have been taking their dead into this incredibly difficult cavern and placing their dead in these specialized areas. And this might be the first, for all practical purposes, cemetery 350,000 years ago. And this is really exciting stuff for anthropology. Many of you might know about the debate about whether or not Neanderthals did the same thing. We're pretty sure Neanderthals buried their dead, but was there symbolic thinking associated with it? And there's the famous flower burial of Shanidar Cave, and the data seem to indicate that maybe this individual, this adult male on the left, was buried with a bunch of flowers, that the pollen was left behind in the dirt. But new research might indicate that it was brought in by animals or sort of other natural processes. So it's still a question up for the debate, but we do know that Neanderthals, especially those who interacted with modern humans, were likely burying their dead as well. So because of this, there's the flowers, because of this, we might need to modify this slide and say 107 billion modern humans, we're pretty sure, have lived and died. But that number might grow as anthropology expands the boundaries, pushes the boundaries into the past, and reacts to sort of these new findings, which is really exciting. So in the grand scheme of the world, though, if you can imagine 177 billion people have died, all the extraordinary sort of things that we do. So here is one human, by the way, and this is my favorite slide because this is about job security for archaeology. So just so you guys know, since we're coming into the Halloween season, for every living human on the planet right now, those of you who done the quick math, there are, wait for it, 15 who have preceded us. So that, again, this is job security, but this is also an exposition of how, when we look at the world in the Long Deray in the biggest scope, we see burial practices that are extraordinary from around the world. And we have a tendency to say that's weird, that's disrespectful, that's whatever, but really it's not. It's humans doing all of these sort of amazing, colorful, interesting, exciting sorts of things. And this is what makes anthropology so exciting. We can't get to all of this, although this is a class that I teach, this panoply of and colorful sort of ways of burying the dead. We're just going to hone in on one little corner of that world and focus on Colorado today. And mostly I'm going to focus on European and Latin sort of burials in Colorado. I'm not talking about indigenous folks, because I'm talking more about sort of post-colonial historic period in Colorado, and just what we do here in this state and how that adds to the extraordinary array of things in the rest of the world. So I took sort of Denver, here's a map of Denver, and I just want to talk about, and I went, and in the first few weeks of the pandemic, I went to all of these cemeteries, the ones in pink. There are about 26 cemeteries, authorized cemeteries in the metro area. We'll talk a little bit at the end about why there are some that aren't authorized. And then I put Boulder on there because since I teach at CU Boulder, I take my students there. And so I have lots of data about Boulder Cemetery, Columbia in particular, that I'd like to share with you. But here's where they are, and they represent all different socioeconomic and religious backgrounds in Denver. And I visited them, and I want to encourage you guys to go and visit them as well, because I have to say there's not a better time to go visit a cemetery than in a pandemic. It's outside, there's nobody around, you're very socially distanced. And when the smoke clears, it's gonna be really nice to go. So here are the 5 cemeteries that I wanted to talk about, and just a general disposition. I did select sort of what we call pioneer cemeteries. This is, again, post-colonial Anglo-Latin individuals for the most part who are buried in these. And some of them are quite large, and some of them are very small. And they hold a variety of folks, and I'll show you videos and maybe give you some tips on what to do once you get there. So before you do, I do want to talk a little bit about 19th century cemeteries, because in the grand scheme of things, there was a perturbation to the system here. For many reasons, Americans and some Europeans at this time pushed back against the old notions of burying their dead right outside the church gate, so that you could visit them every Sunday or every Saturday or whatever day your Sabbath or religious day was. And there are a number of reasons why people decided not to do this. That they moved people out of churchyards into sort of parks that could be visited, and that were often outside of town and places to recreate. And so that you weren't recreating or visiting or disrupting church services, but you were also sort of, being, I'll just get to this, basically sanitary and salubrious, because there was a notion that as these churchyards filled up, and I spent a year in Ireland digging some cemeteries. Sometimes people were 8 and 10 and 12 deep in churchyards, and they just were at capacity. So there was a conscious effort on the part of mostly Christian church leaders at the time to say, we're not going to have them in churchyards. We're going to make them outside of town. We're going to make them sanitary. This was partially too because of a number of wars and a number of pandemics that we suffered that increased the number of dead and in the United States, and the churches were at capacity. So that's why we often have, or used to have, large rolling churchyard or cemeteries on the outskirts of town. Many of these now, though, have been engulfed by the towns around them, and that limits their expansion capabilities. And we'll talk about space in just a minute. Because of this change, the churches were no longer sort of in charge of cemeteries, and consequently they became private and public land, and different cemeteries got treated in very different manners. And that's why you see some that are incredibly well kept up, Mount Olivet on sort of the east side of town, and ones that are not as well taken care of. There's no funding or groups that sort of takes these on. The Columbia Cemetery in Boulder, Riverside in Denver are a little less sort of well maintained, and this is this sort of variation that you get. Actually, in Boulder, they got so mad in the 1920s that they went and dug up a bunch of people from Columbia Cemetery and moved them to the nice one up in uptown. So there's reactions to this as well. And often they are segregated. And sometimes they're segregated by religion or military service or wealth, but also sometimes by ethnicity, although it might not have, or race, I should say, race or ethnicity. And it might not have the same overtones of segregation in a sense that you may not, although there was some of that, but it often had to do with whether or not where you purchased your plots of land and the like. So you go to Fairmount Cemetery on Alameda, and you might see a number of Chinese Americans next to a number of Ukrainian, there's a Ukrainian group next to, a number of people who are Jewish. And that might not be because the cemetery has strictures on that. It might be that's where you sort of bought your plot. So I want to talk about space, because this is something that not just archaeologists think about, although we do think about it, but politicians think about it as well. And so to give you an example of how much space cemeteries take up, let's take a town of 10,000 people. And in a town of 10,000 people, that, to give you an idea of representation, that's these 2 decks at Bronco Stadium. So not big, but a fair number of people, size of a good university, size of a nice small town. And in the course of that, if we sort of divide that out so we can see it visually, that's this many people. And in the course of 1 year of that many people, this many die. So that gives you an idea of and of course that fluctuates, but this is just sort of on average. Now, if you think about all of those people dying, and if they're buried, and some of you have said you wish to be buried, and if you think that each one of those individuals needs to have a grave that's excavated, that's 7 feet by 4 feet by 6 feet, and in theory, don't talk to an archaeologist, but that grave should be undisturbed in perpetuity. That's a fair bit of land, and we can do the math on this. We know that 62 graves, 62 people, equals about 208 feet squared, or or basically an acre in English measurements. That's about a football field, give or take. So to give you an idea of what that is, here's the population of Denver. I think I checked this a few weeks ago. 727,211 in Metro Denver. Yearly death, give or take, is 18,000 people will pass away in our city. And the acres needed is about 300. Now, if every one of those individuals wants to be buried, that's 13 million square feet of land that will be set aside for the disposition of the dead in perpetuity. To give you an idea of how much space that is, many of you come to the museum, that's the entire space of City Park. And that's for 1 year. So think about what happens in 2021, in 2022. And pretty soon you can see that burial and the sort of the status quo that it is not a sustainable practice. And of course, we know that, these are really loose measurements. Some people are cremated, some people are buried in crypts, and they're in much smaller spaces. But on the whole, this should just give you an idea of where people end up and how cemeteries aren't as often long-lasting as we think they are. So there's different trends, and the United States is actually going through a pretty big change in how we bury our dead at the moment. And the rationale behind that is, you know, space is running out. And because of that, notions of cremation are going up. And Colorado is actually one state where it is well over half the people who die in Colorado these days wish for cremation. It's about actually in between 60 and 70% who will be cremated in this state. That differs very much so from, say, southern religious states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, who tend to be at about 80% inhumation or burial. Inhumed means the whole body goes in the ground, inhumation or burial. And this has to do with probably religious strictures and tradition and culture. And so Colorado's different, California too. Oregon, I think, beats us all. They're up at about 80% cremation rate. But in general, inhumation and burial is going down across the country. It's just going down slower in other places. And the reason for this is that there's an awareness of environmentalism. There's a sense of that, you know, that taking up of space after you are deceased. There's a notion about the chemicals and the failure to sort of, you know, reintroduce the nutrients in your body back into the world, that you are embalmed and you sort of, you know, go gracefully into a casket and are not sort of disseminated and out and into dirt. There's a notion too that, you know, it's actually much more expensive to be buried, sometimes between 2, 3, and 4 times as much to be buried than it is to be cremated, although there are lots of other options now. Cremation is not the only one. And then there are sort of a slackening or a loosening, I should say, of religious strictures. So about 30 years ago, the Catholic Church said that cremation was possible. And up until the 70s or 60s, I think 60s, that that was forbidden if you were Catholic. So there are different religious sort of strictures on what can happen to your body afterwards as well. And I'm glad Courtney wants to be a treat. So here's where we get to the sort of the finding patterns in archaeology. This is looking at cemeteries in the aggregate on the whole, and looking at if we can see kind of interesting patterns. So here's a trick that I want to teach you for the next time you go to a cemetery. Recreationally go to a cemetery for fun, not actively for other purposes. So here is a tool that's called Seriation. And this is basically an analysis of frequency. And it sounds scary, but it's really not. So say you were walking around the cemetery with your science hat on, and the first thing scientists do is observe, right? So say you observe these kinds of cemetery headstones, and there on the left is a death's head, and then in the middle is a cherub, and on the right is a willow and urn. And you're sort of like, what's going on there? Like, why are these folks picking them? And by the way, I should say the who, what, when, wheres, archaeologists are really good at answering those. The whys are harder, but seriation is one of the tools that helps us get at the why. So say you're interested in this just simple question, these 3 styles of tombstones. You're gonna do a seriation project. Are you ready? Here we go. So all you do is on your notebook paper or whatever, you write down the variables or the traits that you're gonna look at. In this case, the death's head, the willow and urn, and the cherub. And then you write down the dates of the time periods that you see are affiliated with them, so that, you know, somebody died in 1820 and you make a little mark out to the side. So this is really easy. So say you're going to look at death's head first. What you'll do is you'll walk around, and whatever sample size or portion of the cemetery you look at, you'll say, I'll just make a mark. And for all the death's head in 1811 to 1820, there's that many. And then you'll do it again, and you'll do it all the way through. And pretty soon you have a list of frequencies for those years. Easy enough, right? Very easy. I had to go to graduate school for like 14 years to do, okay, not 14, but it was a lot of years, and I'm very gray because of this, but this is way more fun. You do the same thing for the willow and urn, same sort of thing. The years are the same, the trait is slightly different, and then you do the level of frequency off to the side. And then you do the same thing for the cherub. Easy? And then you line them up. And here's where your artistic sort of elements come into play. So you've got all your numbers, and then what you do is out to the side where there's that 1781 to 1790, you make a little proportional sort of line. And you do that for each of the numbers. And pretty soon you have this kind of frequency bar, and you'll do the same thing for death's heads. And you're just making numbers that are proportional to or bars that are proportional to the numbers that you found. And you do the same thing for willow and urn. And then we do in archaeology what is known as we make a battleship curve. Anybody ever played Battleship? It's the sort of shape that sort of looks like that, which is, I know there's a scientific word for it, but I don't remember what it is, so I'm gonna call it a battleship. And then you move it, and then you put sort of the lowest dates at the bottom, and you see what shows up. and the most recent dates at the top, and you see what shows up, and pretty soon you come up with a pattern. And what you see is that in this case, the death's head is the most frequent, the earliest on. And then as time progresses, and this is, by the way, a real study, I didn't make these numbers up, as you go through, you can see that death's head decrease in popularity, just like Uggs or, you know, Spanx. I don't know, what do people wear this? I'm not fashionable, but so we have, you know, things that come into and go out of fashion. So too do things in the archaeological record and traits like patterns on tombstones. So you can see just by doing a few little numbers that you've got these battleship curves where you can see that the death's head came first, the cherub came second, and the willow and urn came third. And there's probably, when you add that with other information, really interesting stories behind it. And this particular study, which was done by a professor at University of Virginia named James Dietz, found that it had to do with the Civil War and how Americans were sort of pushing back against the notion of unity with Great Britain right before and then immediately after the Civil War. So we were kind of like with Great Britain with the death's heads, we were both doing the same thing. And then as the war sort of ramped up, we kind of went all happy and cheruby. And then after the war, we were like, nope, see you later, England. We're doing our own thing and we're doing a willow and urn. And it sort of speaks to larger social processes just from an analysis of frequency that you can do in a cemetery. So let me give you another example of a cemetery. I've stylized this so it's harder, so you can see it from sort of the air. So up here you have, did I not say the Revolutionary War, Gary? Did I say something wrong? I'm so sorry. I did mean the Revolutionary War if I said it misspoke. Thank you. So here's another cemetery. This is a little bit later. This is a more pioneering period. And lots of times there's data that are missing. And so when you look at observations across lots of numbers and the like, and do seriation across hundreds of tombstones, it becomes this really powerful tool of analysis. And it allows you to infer data that you don't actually have. And this is where people are saying, this is, you're making this up, but I don't think it is. So let's look down, say for instance, at this one part of the cemetery. And you see that you've got a number of individuals, both male and female. We don't know gender, we assume gender just based upon the name. We don't know sex because we're not excavating these, but we see essentially when they died. And you might see a pattern that those tombstones on the left with rectangular tombstones above them that are representing both adults, males and females, and a child, were buried in the 1940s, early 1950s. See that pattern? And that's something, imagine you find that pattern over and over again. You find these similarly styled rectangular tombstones. Well, what if we zoom up and we've got this guy who doesn't have anything on his tombstone, but it's rectilinear, just like the ones below? Could we infer that that man died possibly somewhere between the 1940s and 1950s? I think we can. I think the pattern, if you look at the, you know, lots of tombstones, that's probably a reasonable level of analysis, and an archaeologist can make that case. So when you go to the cemetery and visit, you can make pattern recognition possible as well, and say, I've seen something like that, doesn't have a date, but I could guess the date, or I've seen you know, a style like that that might be affiliated with a particular religion or a secret society of the like, and you can make these sort of inferences as well. One very fun thing is that, you know, we are a colonialist nation. We have lots of roots in lots of places, but Anglos, Europeans who have long history in Denver, have very strong ties to classical roots. And when you go to, say, for instance, the Fairmount Cemetery, you might walk up to this tomb on the bottom that was built in 1899, and it parallels one from Pompeii from 60 BCE. It's exactly the same thing. And that's a 2,000-year difference. And you might not have known that it had its origins in sort of the early Roman state. And that was a place where people could come mourn. And oftentimes on the back, although this person from Fairmont didn't do it, they did panels that showed the achievements in life of the individual who's buried there. But still, the pattern is really strong. I mean, you can't, that's undeniable. So too do we have very strong parallels with obelisks from Egypt. The founding fathers, the early presidents and the like, were very interested in sort of the Napoleonic era of Napoleon sort of invaded Egypt and brought back lots of stuff. And these things are 3,500 years old or so. And they look a lot like, for instance, the tombstones of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, the Washington Monument and the like, those were very popular and very sort of classically rooted in ancient Egyptian history. And if you go to the Riverside Cemetery, and film out the window badly, so excuse this film, but you'll see even on Governor's Row or the like, the perpetuation of obelisks from ancient Egypt in the middle of Colorado, a continent and millennia away from each other. This strong link to this ancient and classical time period, which I think is pretty cool. And then there's sort of the everyman sort of version of the obelisk. For those of you not familiar, this is Boulder, this is the hill, and that's Hale Sciences behind Mrs. Upton here. And that is all developed. That's where all the undergrads live and where all the parties are happening right now. And these are an obelisks that from the 1890s that sort of represent the sort of the everyman. Ancient Greece is also in the mix. On the left is the burial of a child who's holding a dove with the broken wing. And if you go to any cemetery in Denver, you'll find small animals invariably represent the death of an infant or a young child. Broken wings, ewes, rabbits, doves, things like that. That's another pattern that has, you know, multiple thousands of years old in its roots. Cyrus the Great, the 6th century BCE from the Achaemenid Empire. There he is on the left in the middle of Iraq. And there is some Fairmount and Mount Olivet, 20th and 21st century people recapitulating and redoing that which comes from our ancient and classical roots. Although they've thrown in a few Greek and Roman columns for good measure, so they've got all the bases covered for the classical roots. Denver tombstone demography is really sort of fun to study. Here is a chart of data of terribleness, but I just want to zoom in and show you that this is some work that some of my students have done. And this is, okay, so you zoom in and I'm going to explain this really. It looks all very complicated, but it actually is very telling. So I made it nice and pretty. So I've taken on the left age categories, and on the right are students taking about 600, 650, I think, data points on how often you are to live to the next cohort. So what you see is like how likely are you to make it to from 0 to 1, how likely are you to make it to 1 to 2? And if you can see that it's a really, really dangerous time to be alive early in life. It's really dangerous when you're an infant. There's lots that can go on prenatal and postnatal, as you know, tragically, but I'm just trying to talk like a scientist. And then as you get a little bit older, it's still hard because you're still in danger until after you've weaned. Weaning in any time period is dangerous, although we have lots of supplemental things in medical sort of treatment. But you take a little kid off of a diet in the ancient world, or even in the 18th century or 19th century Colorado, and you put them on mush and beer and the like, and they're not as likely to thrive. And so it's still a very difficult time, and the data reflect that. And then by the time you get to be like 2 or 3, you can see the number drops drastically, and it's a really safe time to be alive. Those little kids that age are usually really quite safe. And then the mortality rate picks back up again when you get into your teenagehood. I'm sorry to say it picks back up a fair bit when you get into your 40s, and then your 60s again is another sort of jump in the rate of inability to sort of make it to the next cohort. And that frequency, and this is 19th century data, that frequency is actually almost exact to this day. Even despite different activities and medical intervention alike, proportionally, that's still how our population dies by age group. Life expectancy, 640. We know that women tend to live longer than men, and the data from Denver and Boulder sort of bear this out. It's about a 3.5 year gap. I think it's different in different parts of the country by a little bit. So my students found that, by the way, these are married couples. So if you're married, women tend to longer, and there's basic biological and physiological reasons for this, and some social reasons as well. They also expanded this study out, and they looked at women and men who are not married, and the news is pretty good for single ladies and a little bit bleak for single men. Your life expectancy in the 19th century and 20th century, if you are a single man in Colorado, is not as good. And I don't know the sociological phenomena for that, but it's a strong pattern across cemeteries in the state. Another really one of my favorite studies that one of my students did was couples and who dies first. And of a high percentage, over 60%, the male dies first. And they did an analysis, these students did an analysis of design, material wealth spent on a tombstone and overall layout and decoration, which is more expensive as well. So it all really comes down to money. And in general, on the left, if the man went first and presumably the woman was in charge of the tombstone procurement and design, that's what happened. On the right is more an example of what happens if the woman in the partnership goes first, and there is sometimes differential sort of expenditure and planning on the tombstone. And I'm sure there are really interesting reasons behind that as well, but it was a very strong pattern that these students found. They got a very good grade. So I thought that was kind of a fun study. Gender roles, roles of men and women are played out in the cemetery. So here we have the Smith tomb, and you can see Albert Smith, who unfortunately didn't live very long. He was a lawyer, and then of course his wife buried beneath him, Albert's wife. That was her claim to fame. So there are gender roles as well. You often see the husband's sort of contributions listed under his name, and then the female whom he married is often just named as wife. And I think this speaks volumes about sort of things as well. If excuse the bad photography, but on the left you can see that those are the Mackeys who gave to CU Boulder, and here's the Kittos. So this is Fairmount, Columbia. You can see that regardless of which spouse goes first, the male is almost, not always, because humans aren't really pattern friendly, but we're almost invariably the males are on the left and females are on the right. And again, that doesn't have to do with age or who goes first or the like. Actually, here's John Adams at his house or his crypt in Braintree. John Adams on the left, Abigail on the right, keeping sort of in with this pattern. And it actually goes back to our monarchical roots, that the male was king and the female was queen or consort, and the male was always on the left, the female always on the right. So even a common man is buried like a king in most Anglo-European graves in Colorado. The exception, by the way, is Queen Elizabeth. So heaven forbid if she ever gets buried in Colorado, she'll be on the left and Philip's on the right. When you go to the cemetery, do keep your eyes peeled for unusual looking tombstones, like on the left where look like they're not quite finished, like there's a shawl over them, they're not fully carved, they're broken off in half, or the like. And this is meant to actually to represent a life cut short, that a life that was unfulfilled, and consequently their tombstones reflect that unfulfillment. And these are usually really quite visually striking when you go out and visit them, and they're all across Colorado cemeteries. There's also sometimes great big monuments at cemeteries that are for relatively young people. And there is a notion of what's known as differential levels of grief. We see this in the archaeological record. We often say, oh, this tomb is grandiose and sort of over the top. This person must have made great contributions to society and been very influential. And actually, we have to take into account the fact that in some cases, these individuals died young. And in some cultures, it's more sad. This is not a value judgment. It's the reaction is more acute when a young person dies than when an old person dies. And I tell my students, if I got run over by a bus, it'd be on page 8. If they did, it'd be on page 1. And that's just a factor of age. So there's differential levels of grief. And you see this, for instance, in these two teenagers at Riverside Cemetery. So do look at sort of age and trauma that these individuals experience, because often when parents and parents of means are still in the picture at the time of the death of a young person, this is how it's manifest. And this is something that archaeologists do sort of think about, and you should think about when you go to visit cemeteries. Keep your eyes peeled too for enigmatic symbols. These often represent sort of Masonic affiliation, Order of Odd Fellows, Woodcutters of the World. There's lots of secret societies that still some members, some people in Colorado are members of. They're mostly for men, but there are sort of offshoots of women participants as well. And they often, you can Google these. I didn't have time to put all of them up. They stand for different things. Sometimes you have different ranks or different orders that you are affiliated with, but do keep your eyes peeled for that. My students did a study of this as well, and they found that, why would you belong to a secret society, a Masonic order in, early 20th century Denver and the like? And what they found was if tombstone placement in the cemetery is telling of who you sort of rub shoulders with in death as well as life. And tombstone size and level of decoration and the like is associated with sort of wealth and expenditure, that in general, if you belong to a secret society, you tended to live longer, you tended to be wealthier, and you tended to have bigger monuments. So just like today, sort of social networking is something that is effective, like in business, in society, in partnership, finding partnerships for children and the like. These are the sort of the ways of the world, and they play out in the cemetery just as much as anywhere else. You also keep an eye peeled for local stone carvers. In general, stone carving in Denver seemed to be a little bit inferior, actually, even though we have very good stone, to the stuff that you ordered in. So you'll find patterns of there's a stone carver on the left versus what the Sears and Roebuck or the Wells Fargo will bring you. And even sort of in places like the Boulder Cemetery, you can see that all these folks in the 1890s ordered in their cemeteries. They didn't order in their tombstone. They didn't sort of leave it to the locals to sort of do things. And then there's also vernacular as well, when people chose not to purchase a tombstone or chose to do sort of their own thing. So here's some from Riverside Cemetery, and here's the famous lollipop of a little girl who died of leukemia in Boulder. These are sort of vernacular. These are people doing their own thing as far as cemeteries as well. Well, here's the other thing, is the question is, why do often cemeteries face east? And the reason is that three of the major religions of the world are east of us, and Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And the idea is that you are oriented to, when the rapture comes, whatever deity comes back to claim you on Redemption Day, that you are able to sit up in your grave and face sort of the promise of this, new awakening and the like. And that's why oftentimes many people face east. But as you can see, this is Fairmount Cemetery. Those folks face east, and that makes perfect sense. And then you go one plot over, and they're all facing south. So whereas at Mount Nebo, this is fully Jewish cemetery, every tombstone faces east. So the strictures are much more rigorous for either the people buried there or the people overseeing it. But it's a pattern. So that, I mean, it's kind of unusual. I don't have enough data to speak to Islamic burials in Denver. I wasn't able to sort of do that study, so I'm not sure, but it's something that I'd like to know. So my students tried to figure out, like, okay, if they don't face east, where do they face? Sometimes it's towards roads, but the biggest theory is that this is Colorado and people want to face west so they can see those mountains on days when there are not forest fires. So wrapping up, I just want to end with a few little quirks about living in Colorado and dying in Colorado. And these are things that I think everybody should know. That to embalm, cremate, or prepare a body for death in the state of Colorado and nowhere else, you do not need a license, coursework, or training. That means you or I could start a mortuary business tomorrow. We're the only state that does this. It's highly unusual, and consequently, there are lots of unfortunate things that happen. I think, someday this would be worth a conversation. These sort of strictures were thrown out in the 1980s. They haven't been brought back in. Lots of funeral directors, morticians, and embalmers in the state, and I work with some of them, get their licensures out elsewhere, and then come into the state, and they'll advertise it. So if ever you are shopping around, you might be able to look for those licensures in other states, but we don't require it in the state. So do keep your ear to the ground about some of those sorts of things. If you die in Denver and in other parts of Colorado, but in Denver for sure, you can be buried anywhere. So if you want to go in the backyard, feel free. You just need to notify the authorities in 30 days, and you should be prepared for your property value to decline. So whatever you wish for. And don't worry too much if you find a gravestone in your backyard. I can't even tell you, I haven't been on the job very much, but I can't tell you how many people have brought in fragments of tombstones that are in their backyard. Just the other day, this was brought in or posted, and it was found over on Ivy Street. And don't want you to worry, 99.9% of the time, tombstones fall out of use. They're broken, they're repurposed, they're often put into gardens. Most things are not like the phenomena of Cheeseman Park, which we can talk about in the Q&A. So don't worry, poltergeist is not happening. There's probably not anyone in your backyard. Although if you're not sure, always do call an archaeologist, a coroner, the police, whoever you wish, if you find anything suspicious. And with that, I'm going to end and say thank you all very much. And if you have questions, I see a few of them, please just let me know.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was fascinating.
Good.
So we do have a few questions in the chat. And before we begin, we've got about 20 minutes for questions. If you're an audience member and you have something that you want to ask Dr. Baxter, go ahead and open up that chat and write those in. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. We're sorry if we're not able to get to all of them. So one of them that we just got is, you were just talking about the placement of the tombstones in terms of east, west, north, the direction. Do the words face any particular part of the corpse? Is that like common practice? Is that an individual basis? What does that look like?
Yes, mostly they face towards east as well. So if your tombstone faces east, the words where your tombstone faces east as well. And oftentimes you also have a footstone that delineates sort of the end of where your coffin would have been. But that's not to say that people, again, don't flip it around, face mountains, face roads. Just today, I saw a tombstone that had something on the back that said, walk around to the other side, and it had a little snail. It was kind of cute, actually. So we're breaking out a little bit of the strictures of what people think is, right and proper for a tombstone. And burial practices is one of the most conservative things that humans do. It's one of the things that's the slowest to change. And we're kind of in an age of, I hope that video at the beginning showed you, of people operating sort of outside what is considered the normative burial practices for 21st century. Good question.
That's fascinating. And now that you're mentioning that more conservative and slower to change realm that is tombstones, now that we're seeing a slightly more progressive, gender progressive society, is that represented? Are we seeing that in tombstones that we're seeing now? So do we still have men on the left? Do we still have, the man above the wife, if it's that type of relationship?
One example that I would give you is I've had, I think I'm making this number up. I think it's 826 students take my Archaeology of Death class. And every semester I make them plan their own funerals. And invariably they want to have shish kebab and parties and smoke and drink White Claw and donate themselves to science and kind of go crazy. But I prompt them, and in the end I say, like, okay, this is happening to you tomorrow, so it's not in the future. Oh, what would make you change your mind? And invariably, if an older family member or a more conservative or a religious family member is still in the picture, they will always say, never mind whatever my mom, my dad, my grandmother, my uncle wish for, I will do that. And then they write out that it's usually a traditional tombstone. They don't get as specific about spouses because many of them are not married, but they do, and they defer to their elders. And this is one of those sort of underlying things that the strictures of society sort of curtail the exuberance of youth, sort of change sorts of things. And we're really conformist when we think about it in the end. They hate that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, they hate it.
But it means that generations might pass by, like a Gen Xer may pass away, but those tombstones aren't representative of that generation.
Exactly. That's right.
Fascinating. Mm-hmm. So we have quite a few folks asking, it's interesting that you were mentioning those statistics earlier about Colorado being a heavy cremation state, because we have a lot of questions about cremation and scattering. So the first one about that will, and if you see me looking down, it's because I have a handy legal pad. But one of the questions that we're getting a lot is, are there designated spaces in Colorado for ash distribution? What's the phrase for that?
There are, and they tend to be private land. You can do as well. There's Crestone, Colorado, where you can dispose of cremated human remains. In general, you're not supposed to dispose of them in waterways or in waterways that are close to civilization. You're not supposed to dispose of them on federal or state land. But in general, at least in my experience, there's been a look the other way kind of phenomena. You get into trouble when you dispose of them ashes in indigenous or Native American sites. That is a huge no-no. And I've actually been on a part of a crew that an Anglo person was deposited in a Native area, and we dug out the whole site, and all the dirt was dumped into the river. So that individual did not end up there. So there are strictures for it, but they're not they're impossible to enforce. So people get buried everywhere. So they get, usually in Colorado, they're taken up on side of a mountain and sort of blown into the wind. But when the morticians come to my class and funeral directors, and when you embalm and the like, all that fluid goes into the waterways. There's no, I mean, that goes directly into our drinking water. So when we drain people, that's going into, anyway, another reason to, you know, maybe think about alternative sort of ways of, you know, final disposition. Sorry, that got a little graphic.
No, that is a great transition to
Okay.
The next question that we have. And that question is about alternative disposition practices. So some folks were saying that they really want it to be a tree. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and so these alternative sort of practices are really trending on the coast at the moment, but they are coming to Colorado. So you can become a tree, become a plant, you can be shot into space, you can be pressed into a record. One of my students wants his ashes to be rolled into a blunt and smoked, which is technically cannibalism, but not illegal, just weird. Sorry, I shouldn't judge. You can also do things like alkaline hydrolysis, where you are chemically broken down and sort of basically become fertilizer. You can become mulch. You can have high temperature water break you down. Only a few of these are available in Colorado, and some I think are cost prohibitive, but they are becoming more and more popular, and they are legal. So the state legislature, for example, has legalized alkaline hydrolysis in 2011. So we are progressive in that sort of way. I think a lot of people just don't know about it. So as it becomes more mainstream, I think we are going to see those sorts of trends that we haven't seen actually since burial practices of embalming that came about when the Civil War happened. So I think we're at an exciting time for death. I don't mean to sound like that. Yeah.
And I think, so one of the questions about that is, how do I, as a living person, get more informed about the practices for when I'm no longer a living being? What's a good place to start that research?
Well, one place that I sort of like is, if you guys know the best-selling author named Caitlin Doherty, who wrote a book called Smoke Gets in Her Eyes. She's a young cremation specialist, and she wrote a number of best-selling books. She has founded an order. It's called the Order of the Good Death, and it's based upon the notion that by suppressing death, not talking about it, sending loved ones off to hospice, making others sort of deal with a body after death, that we are psychologically mortally wounding ourselves in lots of ways. And so she and her organization, called the Order of Good Death, do provide lots of information on their website. I was just there today to see how you go about sort of doing these things, and resources to find places, for instance, in Colorado that would provide alternative burial practices. She also has a YouTube video called Ask a Mortician. You might look like you're familiar with that you might find sort of interesting sorts of things about things. Because to be honest, we're a little out of my realm of expertise. I don't do modern burials. I'm interested in sort of the ancient ones, but the patterns of why we're changing parallel the Greeks like you wouldn't believe. It's very, very cool. Anyway, what's the next question?
That's fascinating. And also, I will second that book. It was one of my favorite reads of 2019. Fabulous book. So talking a little more about what your expertise is in, can you tell us a little bit about resources for an individual, one of us visiting a cemetery, and how we could distinguish signs or a good resource for that?
Well, I was just today reading, oh boy, where'd it go? Here it is. I was just today reading this book that's called From the Grave. It's a roadside guide to Colorado's pioneer cemeteries. And it breaks down sort of by region. So if you're not in Denver, it gives you sort of, places to go and the like outside. And it points out places that might be off the beaten path. Because as we know, there's lots, there was no burial law in Colorado before 1876, but there certainly were lots of people here. So there are lots of unmarked cemeteries out there, and this author has found that and sort of collated that as well. Online resources are really good as well. Do look up sort of etiquette and time for when you can visit, because some have sort of dawn to dusk rules, and don't visit maybe when there's an active funeral going on. These are just things I tell my students that maybe you don't know. But yeah, I mean, that was a great resource, and I kind of plan to use it to go out and see some more pioneer cemeteries as the pandemic moves on.
Absolutely. You mentioned a little bit ago about the way that our modern deaths parallel to the ancient Greeks. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right. Well, this is, again, this exercise that I do with my students to sort of, ask them why they want to change. And they say they're worried about money, or they're worried about the environment, or they're concerned about deforestation or taking up land. And, you go to the 6th century BCE amongst the Greeks, who were dealing with the 4-year Athenian pandemic that killed half the town, which was a big town, and they could no longer continue to bury. I mean, Greek is rocky, and then it was even hard to cremate as well. So then we begin to see this shift into sort of ossuaries and mausoleum and group burials, and then later we get into things like catacombs and like. So you see humans adapting and making conscious and unconscious decisions to conform and yet to change to the strictures that they're suffering at the moment. And I wouldn't be surprised in the next few years if we see another sort of large-scale change in how we bury our dead. And the social processes behind that are always fascinating.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
How does that impact your line of work? How does folks choosing to be cremated and then made into trees impact what archaeologists can deduce in the future?
Well, I don't study modern folks in that capacity. So I hope nobody watching the Zoom ever gets excavated, because I don't think there's a scientific purpose behind it. But I do think it's interesting to say, for example, this is a one offshoot of my research, to figure out how we treat, for instance, our least citizens. And at this moment, I imagine you can imagine who those are. How do we bury the least of our least? And what does that say about our structure and our power structure and authority as a society? And can we see parallels in the ancient prehistoric world? So when we find the least burials there, is that revelatory about how that ancient society was structured? Because if I can kill you, or if I can bury you outside the city upside down with no grave goods, that's power. And that is manifest in graves.
Wow, that is such a unique perspective. I thank you for that.
Yeah.
So we've got about 9 minutes left, so we'll keep going on the questions. We have so many amazing questions in the chat. I'm so sorry if we don't get to yours in particular, but we had a few pop up about Cheeseman Park. Can you tell us a little bit about the history for those of us who might not be familiar with it?
Well, I don't know it as well as I should, but my understanding is that Cheeseman Park was originally set aside as a cemetery. And then as it kind of bumped up against, Millionaires Row, Cap Hill, where those, highbrow housing sort of developments were happening in the middle of the silver sort of boom, that became prime real estate. And consequently, the locals wanted a place to recreate. And so it was kind of plowed under, and they hired some people. I think they were suspect. They were unable to get all of the known burials out. They did move some of them to other places, but later those burials kept popping up, and I believe there are still people out there. I was looking through the archives at the Denver Library the other day, and I was looking at the number of people buried in Cheeseman Park, the tombstones from the 1880s, 1890s, and there were a lot of them. And when you look at these pioneer cemeteries, what's on the surface, it's like icebergs. What's on the surface is not indicative of what's below, because even like at the Columbia Cemetery, there's about one standing tombstone for every 2 to 3 people who are there. And that's including, that's not including the family plots where it's one tombstone for a whole family. But they've just fallen down. They're insufficient. They weren't maintained. So there's often lots more under the surface than what we see. And
wow.
No different, yeah.
There's plenty of ghost stories there, probably.
I hope not.
They're friendly. So speaking about history, somebody asked in the chat if developers are allowed to disturb grave sites on property that they are planning on owning, just purchased, anything like that, or if there's any regulations that prevent that.
There is a burial law, and if you do hit human remains on your property, it's one of the only things from an archaeological or historic context that you are prohibited from digging legally. So if you do hit human remains or think you hit human remains, you are required by law to call the coroner, to call the police, and have it sort of assessed. And I think just the other day, I think some people on the Zoom, not the other day, but a few months ago, a whole cadre of DMS people walked over to the zoo because somebody had turned in a skull, and it was an animal skull, but it does pop up. So human remains do pop up, and so do call the authorities and be within compliance of the law, because there's an ethical and a sort of a legal strictures to uphold as well, I think.
So what does that look like, thinking back to your presentation? So theoretically, I could be buried anywhere. I could choose to be buried on my own property. what happens if my property is then purchased by someone who's going to tear it down, and are they allowed to?
They are allowed to pay for someone to exhume and move you. So you actually, once your property falls out of your family or immediate, whomever guardians, they own you. They can't mess with you without going through legal authorities, but they can pay to have you moved. So I think that's one of the reasons why lots of Coloradans don't opt to be buried in their backyard, because they could end up in a pool or, something like that. So that's why they're set aside to, a cemetery or a cremation or the like.
That makes sense. So we have a few people, and this is about our 5-minute mark, so I think this might be our last question. A few people are asking about your background, how you got into this field, and any fun stories that you want to share.
Yes, my background was pre-med until I hit organic chemistry. But no, I went on an archaeological dig my freshman year of college to Tunisia, which my parents still are wondering why they sent me. And this is the city of Carthage. And I had a very lovely professor who was very famous from Oxford. And he wouldn't let us drink water. He would only let us have bourbon on site. And he put me 150 yards from everyone else into a Byzantine grave that they had to lower me down into and pull the ladder because, I don't know, there wasn't enough room to work. And there were 6 people down there. And the second night I was there, I was 18 and a half. They pulled the ladder, they took break, they went back to, they left me there overnight. So I had to sleep in a grave my first night, which did not go well, as you could imagine. And I didn't want anything to do with human remains after that. But at the end of the dig, I did bring those 6 people back, which is so not ethical or legal now. And I'm ashamed to say it, but it was the impetus for me to sort of, I hope, be a more ethical archaeologist now. I put those humans back together, 2 adults and 4 children from that grave from about the 7th century AD. I did fly them back home, so they did go back home to be buried. I wouldn't ever do that again, but it was kind of always an interest because humans are time capsules. As laden as we are with implications of racism and colonialism and all these sorts of things, we are very good data when it comes down to it. We have DNA, we have strontium isotope, we have height, stature, weight, health, physicality sort of data points, which are windows into the past. And to study these and to study with, permission of descendant communities and the like, I think is such important work and something that the Denver Museum is really, really excellent at. So I feel very lucky to be here. But it's one of the reasons I am sort of interested in human remains, but really I do pottery and architecture. Human remains is sort of a phenomena of my dissertation research at CU Boulder, where I was looking at, I'm going too long, I'm almost done. I was looking at, hundreds of photographs that were taken by archaeologists from 100 years ago. And they happened to photograph the human remains of ancestral Pueblo people. And it's not okay to dig ancestral Pueblo people now. It's just not okay. But there's that loophole of, I didn't disturb anybody, but I did look at photos of those human remains and try to do a reanalysis. And I do think it's in an ethical gray area, and I'm still struggling with that as far as publication, but I do think it's going to yield really, really interesting information if, with the proper collaboration, I can publish it one day.
That is fascinating. And I think it's important. I think science has this in every field where you start looking at practices that were okay 10, 20, 30 years ago, and you start questioning them. So kudos to you for continuing to question and trying to find the light in that gray area so that you don't stay in that middle ground. So major kudos.
Thanks.
We've got about 2 minutes left. Would you like to say any parting wisdom? We know this was a shorter program, only an hour, but anything that you want to leave for folks to know before they go?
Please go visit a cemetery. Please email me if you have questions, or let's have coffee sometime at the museum, or I don't know, just keep asking questions and keep being curious. And I hope that you guys have experiences out there with your science caps and, maybe some of the skills that you learned today. And thank you so much for listening. That was just so kind of you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Baxter. I learned a lot. I will definitely go out into a cemetery for a non-spiritual walk and have my scientist cap on. I hope that our attendees will as well. Thank you to everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time at one of our other virtual programs. Thank you all so much.
Cheers.